Hi guys, it's Amy from Polyreader. I'm back with my November wrap up. So the first book I finished, or the first book I want to talk about from November, is something I don't have with me because I got it from the library, and that is The Tooth by Shirley Jackson. It's actually a collection of short stories, and the main short story of the collection, which is one of her most famous stories, is The Tooth, which is a story that Shirley Jackson is most renowned for, I believe, other than her long fiction. She is essentially the queen of turning the mundane to the macabre. She writes really interesting stories about things that sort of happen in everyday life and makes them spooky and turns them into horror. It's hard to explain, but The Tooth is really good. I highly recommend you read it if you haven't already. You can actually read the whole of the short story The Tooth by itself on the New York Times website. I'll leave a link to it down below. The book that I read had a series of other stories in it which were also really great, but that is definitely the highlight of the book. I gave it 4 out of 5 for the collection. I would have given that story alone 5 out of 5, no doubt, because it's just such a good story. It packs a real punch. I've been thinking about it a lot since I read it, and I've spoken about it with a few people since then as well, and mentioned to a few people that they should get online and read it if they haven't already. The second book I finished was an audiobook, and that was The Greatest Love Story Ever Told by Nick Offerman and Megan Mullally. Hopefully I'm pronouncing her name right. They are both actors that I don't really watch a lot of, but I know a fair bit about them, and I was really excited to learn about their book because I love hearing about people's relationship stories when they've been together for a long time. So I found it really cute. It was a nice read, a nice listen, I should say. I think that it was kind of made to be an audiobook. I can't imagine, I know that there's pictures and photos in the hard copy, but listening to them narrate it themselves gave it another element that I think would be lacking in the book. I assume a lot of people are reading it to themselves in their voices, but they just have a really nice banter between one another as a long-term couple. It's really nice to hear their attraction and connection in the audiobook. It feels like you're sitting around with them, hearing their story in real life. So yeah, it was really nice. And because they're actors, they're good at reading it as if they're not reading it, reading as if they're just sort of saying it off the top of their head. So that was really nice too. I gave it 3 out of 5. It's not amazingly written, but it was a really cute story, and I think that there's not a lot of relationships in Hollywood that are as long-lasting as theirs, and they talk about their experience with infertility and their struggles with deciding whether or not to have kids and how it's affected their relationship, and like little sort of not rules, but like decisions they've made along the way throughout their relationship that has made it stronger. Like they never have longer than, I think it's 2 weeks apart ever, and it's obviously difficult to do that when you're both actors, but they make an effort to make sure that they don't spend too much time apart, which has helped them, I think, to maintain a stable relationship. So yeah, it was a good audiobook. I recommend it on audio if you're going to give it a read. The next book I finished was The Lost Man by Jane Harper. This is Jane Harper's 3rd book. I think it's her best book. It's not in the series. It's a completely separate novel, but it is a crime novel, so it's still along the same lines. Different story. You know, you're reading it and you're thinking it's just another crime story, but it does have a lot of important messages, and I think overall it's sort of a commentary on domestic abuse and the weight of family. I think that, like I said, it's her best novel. I think it's written the best. I think it has the most important messages in it. I enjoyed it the most. I read it in a single day, in maybe 1 or 2 sittings. The whole time I was trying to figure out what was happening in my head, which is always, you know, engaging and helps you to sort of want to read more, I guess. And that's the whole point of crime fiction, right? But yeah, I really think that if you're going to pick up anything by Jane Harper, I recommend this one. I think that she has a really strong gift for shaping Australian landscape really vividly. In all of her books, that seems to be one of the main elements. So The Dry was about living in the country and bushfire. This one is about also the country, but more like the desert. There's not much around. It's mostly just dry earth, and she paints a really good description of it, and you sort of feel dehydrated while you're reading it. She's also really talented at creating uniquely standalone characters that are flawed. So you don't hate the characters. You hate some of the characters, well I did, but each character is so well crafted that you sort of can imagine them all as unique individuals. I find that some writers can't really do that, and a lot of the characters sort of blend in together, but no, she's really good at creating unique standalone characters, which is really good. She also has the ability to create a really unique outcome for a crime novel. I'm always surprised at the end of her books, so that's something I really appreciate in crime. I get bored when I figure out what's going to happen before it happens. Usually when that is something that I discover, I don't really want to read anymore because there's no point. But this is so well written that you want to keep reading, but also you don't really know what's going to happen until it happens. And it was there all along, you know. So I gave that one 4 out of 5. The next book I read is something that I've been meaning to read for a couple of years, since it was nominated for the Stella Prize longlist. And that is The Hate Race by Maxine Beneba Clark. This is a painfully truthful memoir about growing up black in white middle class Australia. I think that it should be essential reading for all Australians. I know that a lot of people don't read, but if they did, this is something they really should be reading, because it is able to sort of create this nostalgia for everyone that has sort of grown up in Australia, especially in schooling in Australia. There's like little things in here like the Women's Weekly cake book that everyone's parents sort of had, especially in the 80s and 90s, with all of the quirky cakes that our parents would make for us at our birthday parties. And it's sort of an awakening for people who may not be aware of the privilege that they grew up with. She does a really good job of explaining that from a black person's perspective, and I think a lot of people may think that they understand, but they don't understand, and they really need to read this type of stuff to be able to see things from other people's perspectives a bit more clearly. So I gave this one 5 out of 5. I really loved it. I think that I'll read it again sometime. I think I'll probably recommend it to heaps of people I know, and it was great writing, and it was a really interesting story. So really good book, 5 out of 5. The next book is something that was recommended by a bunch of other people on booktube. I've had it on my shelf all year, and I've sort of been putting off reading it just because the expectation was so high and I didn't know if I would love it as much as everyone else did. So I get a bit standoffish with books sometimes when there's really high expectations out there and amazing reviews everywhere, because you just don't know if you're going to feel the same. But I'm glad I did, because it ended up being one of my favourite books this year so far, and that's From the Wreck by Jane Rawson. I don't know how to explain this other than it was marvellous. It was so unique. I've never read anything like this. It was sort of like a historical fiction / sci-fi. There were some really weird elements in there. There's sort of this alien type figure that morphs from human to octopus to cat to, yeah, like birthmark. It's really bizarre, but it works surprisingly, and the story is really captivating, and the prose is really wonderfully written. So it's just the weirdest but best book I've read this year, I think. The story was heavily influenced by Jane Rawson's family history, which made it even more interesting to me. When I finished it, there's a little part at the end where she discusses how the character is based off someone in her family that was in fact in a shipwreck in Australia back in the 1800s, I think, 1859. But yeah, there's nothing I've really read like this, so it just sort of blew me away and completely forgot about everyone else's expectations when I was reading it because I was enjoying it so much. So I highly recommend it, and I gave it 5 out of 5. The next one I picked up was something from the library, and I think it may have been from Jen Campbell's channel. I'm not 100% sure, but I'm pretty sure someone else on booktube discussed this. A collection of prose and poetry by Lang Leave called Sea of Strangers. The whole book essentially is about love and loss, self-discovery and empowerment. I found the prose really easily accessible. I think a lot of people who don't read poetry would be able to pick this up and enjoy it, sort of along the lines of Rupi Kaur, but I think a bit more interesting, or maybe a bit, I don't know how to differentiate between the two, but I think this one's kind of a bit more melancholic than that type of thing. She's got a really simple approach to writing prose and poetry, but the themes are quite hard-hitting. So I'll read something out to give you an example. There are days when the melancholy settles on you like a sudden change in the weather. The kind of sadness that is intangible, like the presence of an ache where you just can't pinpoint exactly where it hurts, you just know that it does. So yeah, she's just got a way of sort of describing things that a lot of us feel really simple way, and in a really simple way, and it just kind of lingers in your head a little bit after you've finished, you know. They're all really different. Some of them are more prose like that, some of them are more written in more of a poetry style. But yeah, it's good. I recommend it. I gave it 4 out of 5. I couldn't really fault it. It wasn't didn't blow me away, but there wasn't really anything wrong with it at the same time, so it was good. 2 more to go. So this one is something I got from the publisher. It's called Fed Up by Gemma Hartley. I was really excited to receive a copy of this from Hachette, so thank you, Hachette. This is pretty much exactly along the lines of the feminist books that I really like to read, the non-fiction types of feminist books. I found myself pretty much like fist pumping along to this because it's so relatable, and I really didn't expect to enjoy it as much as I did. I think because I've read so much feminist non-fiction now, a lot of the time I'm reading the same ideas just regurgitated over and over, and it's hard to find something that is as empowering now that I've read a lot of it. But this one was really good, really nice new perspective. Not necessarily a new perspective, but she sort of delves deeper into things that haven't been touched on a lot yet. I think that everyone needs to read this to get more of an understanding of the emotional labor that women tend to end up carrying in society, in households, in workplaces. This is the invisible stuff that you don't really think about, but is sort of happening all of the time. And it's the reason women get called nags, and it's the reason, you know, women are always stressed and strung out because they're sort of carrying this invisible load that is really difficult to get across to people that aren't also doing the same thing, because they've never had to worry about it, because they've always had a woman in their life that has sort of dealt with a lot of that type of thing. So this can be anything from thinking about what food you need in the house to be able to create the meals for the week, to doing the budget, which I know a lot of people sort of share these days. But yeah, there's hundreds and hundreds of things. She goes into a lot of it. A lot of it comes out during motherhood, when there's children in your life and you sort of fall into these subconscious gender roles. Even same-sex couples, there's generally one that will sort of take over the more mothering, nurturing role than the other one, and it's just sort of the way that it always is in relationships. There's always an imbalance somewhat. But this book does a really good job of explaining one woman's perspective, who is also in a really stable relationship, and explaining it so that it's more understandable for those who think that they aren't experiencing this issue. A lot of the time they are roles that we sort of picked up on from childhood, that we maybe witnessed our parents or our caregivers or our family, just the habits that they were in sort of impact our view and our subconscious bias towards the roles that we take on in relationships. I just think this book does a really good job of opening up a dialogue about the imbalances that are happening in relationships, but not only relationships, also in the workplace, and in society in general. It's in politics, it's everywhere. Really brilliant book, highly recommend it. If you think that you're not dealing with emotional labor, I think you should read this book because you'll probably find that you are. And yeah, it's really good to just open up a dialogue with your partner or whoever it is that you are taking that load on for, and yeah, just getting to the bottom of it and read this book. It's really good. This was also released this year, I should have mentioned. I think it came out in October, so yeah, brand new. Get a copy, buy it for people that you love for Christmas as well. It's a good idea. The last book is the book that I picked for Lit Ladies Book Club, first ever book club that is actually public. So there, if you don't know already, Lit Ladies is a women's sort of like a place where we share books we're reading, encourage each other to read more. We talk about female writers that we love. It's been a private Facebook group for about 3 or 4 years now, maybe going on 5 years. And it's been so successful, it just grows and grows. And so now I've turned it into a public blog / website. There's lots of things coming in the near future. We're still working on it, but at the moment we've just opened up our first ever book club, which is nearly finished. And the book I chose is The Second Cure by Margaret Morgan. I should also mention, I didn't choose it myself. Collectively, Lit Ladies, the original Lit Ladies members voted, and this is the book that ended up getting chosen. I'm not going to talk too much about it today because I'd like to save a lot of that for the public discussion. I will say this is a brand new dystopian Australian science fiction futuristic sort of novel which deals with politics, religion, the patriarchy, all of the fun stuff. It's pretty jam-packed full of things. It's a really stimulating book. I was sort of engaged the whole way through. There's so much, like there's even some raunchy sex scenes towards the end. It's just a wild ride. So the writer is actually a scientist, biologist and a writer. So there's a lot of really sciencey stuff in here, which is super interesting and easy to understand because she writes it in such a way that she knows exactly what she's talking about, but she makes it accessible for the uneducated. So that makes it really unique. But also the story is super engaging and there's a lot going on. It's essentially set in Sydney and Brisbane at the same time. There's some political stuff going on. I don't want to say too much more because I'll ruin the discussion, but I really recommend you read it if you haven't already, and I will let you guys know when I do have something available to, a platform available to discuss this, or where I can point you to look at the discussion that happened, essentially. So yeah, that is everything. We've already got a nice stack coming along for December, but I'm a bit behind with videoing, so that's my November wrap up. I will be back soon with another video. Thanks for watching. Bye.